At night, the Topkapi Palace gleamed like a dream above the dark waters of the Bosphorus. Its golden domes caught the moonlight, and through latticed windows came faint whispers, the rustle of silk, the soft echo of laughter that never reached the outside world. Behind those jeweled doors, the West imagined a paradise, a place where beauty ruled, and every breath smelled of jasmine and rosewater. Painters, poets, and travelers called it the heart of the East's pleasure, the Sultan's harem. But the truth was far darker. The harem was not a temple of desire. It was a prison of it, a world built on silence, where a woman's worth was measured by the way she smiled, the way she danced, the way she obeyed. Every curtain concealed a secret. Every mirror reflected fear. The same hands that adorned these women with gold could, with one word, condemn them to death. Within these walls lived hundreds of women, slaves, captives, and dreamers, bound to one man who owned both their bodies and their fates. They came from distant lands, the Balkans, Circassia, Georgia. Their names erased, their identities replaced with beauty and obedience. To the world outside, they were the Sultan's treasures. But inside, they were pawns in a game of survival. Behind the perfume lingered blood. Behind the music hid screams. And beneath the shimmer of silk lay the cold steel of power. This was the empire's most guarded secret, a world where desire met cruelty and love became a weapon. The Western world saw only the shimmer of gold, but within those corridors, every smile came at a cost. They called it the House of Felicity, but for many, it became a house of horrors. She was no older than 15 when they took her. Her name, whatever it once was, would never be spoken again. She came from a quiet village in the Balkans, where the air smelled of pine and the church bells marked the passing of days. One morning, before the sun had even risen, riders appeared, men in silk and steel, speaking a language she did not understand. By nightfall, her village was ash and silence. Her mother's hands had slipped from hers, and the girl was bound for a place she could not imagine, the heart of the Ottoman world. She was not the first, nor the last. For centuries, the empire's beauty flowed from the same river of sorrow. From the mountains of the Caucasus to the shores of the Black Sea, slave traders scoured the lands for girls of fair skin, bright eyes, and unspoiled youth. They were sold like jewels in the bustling slave markets of Constantinople, inspected, bargained for, and sent through the great gates of the Sultan's palace. There, the transformation began. The girl was washed, perfumed, and dressed in silks. Her old clothes and her past were burned. She was given a new name, often from Persian or Arabic, soft, beautiful, and meaningless to her. In the harem, she would be taught everything: how to walk, how to bow, how to smile. Tutors schooled her in language, poetry, and the art of pleasing. Every gesture, every glance, every word was part of her training. She was being sculpted, not into a woman, but into a symbol of perfection. The harem was not chaos. It was order, a hierarchy built on desire and obedience. At the bottom were the odalisques, the serving girls. Above them stood the iqbals, favorites who had caught the sultan's eye. Then came the khadans, the royal consorts, each holding her own apartments, attendants, and wealth. And above all others reigned the Haseki Sultan, the sultan's most beloved. But power here was fragile. Beauty was both weapon and weakness. At the top of this shimmering pyramid ruled two shadows, the Valid Sultan, the sultan's mother, and the Kizlar Aga, the black eunuch who guarded the women. Together they controlled every secret, every letter, every breath within those walls. The Valide Sultan was untouchable, the only woman with true authority. Even the sultan bowed his head to her wisdom. The Kizlar Aga, castrated in youth and loyal only to his master, was the keeper of the harem's keys. He knew which women would rise and which would vanish. To be chosen by the sultan was a moment both of triumph and terror. When his gaze fell upon a concubine, her fate was sealed. She would be adorned, prepared, and sent to his private chamber. Servants whispered prayers for her, because the sultan's pleasure was unpredictable and his mood divine law. Some were never summoned again. Others rose overnight, their names carried through the corridors like wildfire. They were granted jewels, servants, and chambers of their own. And if they bore the Sultan a son, they ascended to near royal power. Yet that, too, came with danger. Because within the harem, motherhood was not sanctuary, it was war. A son meant succession, and succession meant blood. Each mother fought in silence to secure her child's future, to whisper her way into the Sultan's favor, to survive the jealous stares of rivals who longed to replace her. Behind every song and smile lay betrayal. Behind every gift, a hidden blade. And always, watching from above, the Valide Sultan ensured that balance never tipped too far. Her word could exile a favorite to the old palace, or order her quiet death in the night. Years passed, and the young girl, once a frightened captive, learned to move through this golden maze. She learned that silence was safety, and beauty was currency. Her laughter became calculated, her tears hidden. She knew the language of glances, the rhythm of secrets. She knew when to be seen, and when to disappear. She had been remade body and soul into a servant of empire, a jewel in a cage. And though her hands were covered in silk, she could still feel the weight of the chains that had brought her here. For in the harem, freedom was an illusion, and love a trap. The Sultan's touch could raise a woman to power or erase her from existence. One moment she was a goddess, the next, a ghost. And so the women smiled, perfectly, beautifully, knowing that behind the veil of paradise lurked the promise of oblivion. Because for those who rose too high, beauty became a curse, for the Sultan's love could so easily turn into his wrath. By daylight, the harem glittered, jeweled mirrors, marble baths, laughter echoing down silk-draped halls. But when night fell, that laughter turned to whispers, and whispers turned to fear. For in this palace of beauty, jealousy was the truest ruler. No one slept easily in the harem. Behind every curtain, an enemy smiled. Behind every compliment, poison waited to bloom. A single look from the Sultan could ignite a war, not between armies, but between women whose only weapons were charm and silence. Among the odalisques and favorites, power was not given. It was stolen. It began with glances. A lingering gaze from the Sultan during an evening performance. A new bracelet gifted for a song. The tiniest favor could turn a servant into a rival. Those who had once bathed together in rosewater now plotted each other's ruin. There is a story whispered through the centuries, perhaps legend, perhaps truth, of two women who shared the Sultan's heart. One was his long-beloved favorite, the other, a newcomer of rare beauty whose laughter caught his attention like a song. The old favorite, sensing her fading light, invited the new girl to bathe with her one afternoon. The water shimmered with oils and petals. Servants were dismissed. Behind the veil of steam, silence reigned. Moments later, a scream echoed through the halls. By the time the eunuchs arrived, the pool was still, and one woman's lifeless body floated among the roses. The other, trembling, insisted it had been an accident. The Sultan said nothing. The next night, she too vanished. Some said she was sent away. Others whispered she was wrapped in velvet and given to the sea. This was the unspoken rule of the harem: no death without beauty. When a woman fell from favor, she did not face the sword. The Ottomans called it the silent punishment. She was dressed in fine cloth, her hands bound gently. A velvet sack was placed over her body, embroidered even in death. Then, under moonlight, servants carried her to the palace shore. No one spoke. The waves waited in silence. One final prayer was murmured, and the sack was cast into the Bosphorus. The water accepted her quietly, without splash or cry. Her name would never be spoken again. Her room would be emptied before dawn, her belongings divided, her memory forbidden. And yet, for every woman drowned, another rose to take her place. Even the Sultan himself was not immune to the madness that jealousy bred. Love and power had no boundary, and affection could turn to execution in the space of a breath. There was once a sultan who, convinced of betrayal, ordered every concubine who had ever shared his bed to be executed in a single night. They were led to the baths, dressed in white silk, their eyes filled with confusion. The same hands that had adorned them now sealed their fate. By dawn, the marble floors ran slick with rosewater and blood. Others met their end more quietly. A silk cord, a symbol of imperial grace, was wrapped around the neck of a condemned woman. No blade, no noise, only the tightening of fabric. Death delivered with elegance. Those who survived learned to move like ghosts, to speak only when spoken to smile without feeling. Because a misplaced word could end a life. A servant's whisper, a rival's rumor, a jealous suspicion. Any of these could reach the Valid Sultan's ear and turn affection into execution. Even the eunuchs, bound by duty and silence, lived in fear, for they too could be punished for failing to prevent scandal. The harem was not just a home, it was a theater of constant surveillance. Eyes everywhere, secrets nowhere. And jealousy did not belong only to the women. The Sultan's own paranoia grew as his heart divided between favorites. Each new love meant a new threat. To love one too much was to risk rebellion from another, and to trust too deeply was to invite betrayal. Thus, many chose to love no one at all. But the women could not escape their own longing. In a world where love was forbidden yet demanded, where desire meant survival, emotions became weapons. They smiled through their fear, sang through their sorrow, and danced while knowing that one wrong step could seal their fate. The air of the harem was thick with perfume and secrets. Every fragrance carried memory. The scent of musk meant passion, rosewater, cleansing, jasmine, mourning. When the wind blew from the Bosphorus, carrying the smell of salt, some women would turn pale. They knew what that smell meant. The sea did not forget. And so life went on, trapped between beauty and terror. The Sultan's gaze was both salvation and doom. A gift of pearls might follow a night of tenderness, or an order of death. The same lips that kissed could condemn. For in this golden cage, jealousy was not sin. It was law. And as time passed, the women learned that survival required silence, that trust was suicide, and that the most dangerous emotion of all was love. Because in the harem, love was not affection. It was ambition, weaponized and fatal. And those who gave their hearts freely were the first to lose their heads. In a world where love was power, affection was a death sentence. The harem had always been a mirror, a reflection of the empire itself. When the Sultan was wise, the palace pulsed with balance and order. When he was cruel or weak, its marble halls filled with whispers, fear, and the stench of blood. And in the centuries of Ottoman rule, there were sultans whose hearts grew so twisted by absolute power that the line between love and lunacy vanished entirely. They were gods in their own minds and monsters in everyone else's. When Sultan Ibrahim I inherited the throne, the empire had already begun to crack beneath its own weight. He had been locked away for years in the cafes, the gilded cage where princes were imprisoned to prevent rebellion. There in the silence, his sanity rotted like fruit left too long in the sun. When the cage opened and the crown was placed upon his head, Ibrahim stumbled into power like a man emerging from a dream. The harem became his refuge, his theater of pleasure and paranoia. He surrounded himself with hundreds of concubines, searching for the perfect body, the perfect face, the perfect fantasy. History remembers his obsession: flesh. He adored women of unusual size, calling them his walking treasures, believing that the empire's strength was reflected in their abundance. But obsession soon curdled into madness. One night, rumors reached his ears. Whispers that his concubines had taken lovers, that betrayal had spread like poison through the harem. The thought consumed him. In a single breath of rage, Ibrahim gave an order that would stain his reign forever. The women, 280 in total, were awakened from their beds, wrapped in fine silk, and led silently to the palace gardens under moonlight. One by one they were bound, placed into sacks, and carried to the edge of the Bosphorus. The waves were calm that night. The stars bore witness. The eunuchs obeyed without a word. By dawn, the sea was littered with velvet, floating graves beneath the golden light of morning. And Ibrahim slept peacefully, believing he had cleansed his paradise of sin. If Ibrahim's madness came from indulgence, Murad IV's came from control. He ascended the throne as a child, in a time when the empire trembled with rebellion. By the time he became a man, Murad had learned only one lesson, that fear was stronger than love. He outlawed alcohol, tobacco, and even coffee, declaring them corruptions of the soul. But his laws were more than moral. They were weapons. He would disguise himself at night, wandering the streets of Istanbul, testing his own decrees. Those caught drinking or smoking faced the Sultan himself, and his blade. But even within the harem, his tyranny took root. Servants trembled at the sound of his footsteps. The concubines lived in constant dread of his temper. His eyes, dark and unblinking, could strip the warmth from any room. It is said that one night, a favorite concubine offered him wine, a gesture of affection, a private rebellion meant to soothe his heavy heart. For a moment, he smiled. Then, as the cup touched his lips, he remembered his own law, and he strangled her with his bare hands. When dawn came, he ordered her body buried without ceremony. He then prayed for forgiveness, not for her death, but for his weakness in almost loving her. Under Murad, the harem became a sanctuary of silence. Music stopped. Laughter died. The women learned to move like shadows, to breathe without sound. The Sultan's heart was a tomb, and his rule, a sermon of blood. Before madness became terror, it was temptation. Selim II, son of the great Suleiman the Magnificent and Harem Sultan, inherited an empire at its height, but his crown was heavier than he could bear. He was no warrior, no statesman. He was a man of indulgence, drawn to wine, poetry, and women. The harem under Selim became a world without rules. Days blurred into nights, music filled the marble halls, and fountains ran with sweet sherbet and rose water. The Sultan spent his days reclining on cushions, surrounded by dancers, goblets of Cypriot wine spilling from his hands. But pleasure, like power, demands sacrifice. The harem swelled to excess, rivalries festered, the Valide Sultan lost her grip, and discipline gave way to decadence. Concubines vied for the Sultan's fleeting attention, offering beauty, song, and secrets. The palace that once governed the empire's heart became a den of chaos. Every night a feast, every morning a funeral. One evening, drunk beyond sense, Selim slipped on the marble floors of his bathhouse, striking his head on the edge of the pool. The man who had ruled the world's mightiest empire died not in battle, not in glory, but surrounded by the scent of wine and women. His death was quiet, his legacy a warning. 3 sultans, 3 mirrors of the same disease. Ibrahim, the slave of desire. Murad, the priest of fear. Selim, the prisoner of pleasure. Each ruled over a world gilded in gold and soaked in sorrow. And though their sins were different, they shared the same truth. Absolute power is the slowest form of insanity. The harem was their kingdom within a kingdom, a stage upon which they played gods. Every woman within its walls was both muse and victim, adored and disposable. And as their lusts deepened, so did their paranoia. Doors were locked, servants disappeared. The palace air grew heavy with incense and suspicion. Those who entered the Sultan's favor did not sleep soundly, for love was as fatal as treason. Even the Valide Sultans, once queens of the harem, could not control the madness forever. They watched their sons crumble under the weight of crowns, their cruelty bleeding from the same source that once made them divine. The empire itself began to change. The strength that had built nations now turned inward, devouring its own heart. The grandeur of the Ottoman world was still dazzling to the outside eye, but behind its shimmering walls, the center was rotting. And so the harem, that house of felicity, became not a symbol of glory, but of decline. Its perfumes masked decay. Its silks hid scars. Its music drowned out the cries of the forgotten. The empire that had once conquered continents now consumed itself in its own pleasure. The throne that had commanded armies now trembled beneath the weight of one man's desires. Power without limits had unmade them all. And as the centuries passed, the stories of these sultans, their obsessions, their murders, their madness, became warnings whispered in the corridors of history. Because what they destroyed was not just lives. It was the soul of an empire. They called her Gulbahar, Rose of Spring. But it was not her name. It was the one given to her the day she entered the harem. Her real name had been left behind, buried somewhere in the village she once called home, erased by distance and silence. Now she was only one of hundreds, another faceless beauty drifting through corridors heavy with perfume and fear. Days in the harem bled into each other like colors in water. Morning bells, baths of rosewater, hours of embroidery or music lessons, then the long evenings, endless, glittering, hollow. The women spoke in whispers, their words floating like ghosts through the marble halls. No one ever laughed too loudly. No one cried. To show emotion was to reveal weakness, and weakness was a scent predators could smell. Every movement was watched. The eunuchs stood at every doorway, eyes expressionless, hands folded, always listening. The Valida Sultan's spies drifted through the rooms like shadows, recording every glance, every rumor, every whisper of discontent. Even the walls seemed to have ears. And so the women learned to live quietly, perfectly, obediently. At night, Gulbahar lay awake, staring at the painted ceiling of her chamber. She could hear the faint hum of fountains from the courtyard, water trickling endlessly, mocking the sound of tears she could not shed. Somewhere beyond the curtains, another woman sobbed softly, muffling her cries in her pillows. No one dared comfort her. In the harem, compassion could be mistaken for conspiracy. For most, the greatest punishment was not death, it was uncertainty, the waiting, the endless wondering. Would tonight be my turn? Would the Sultan summon me? Would he forget me forever? Some prayed for his attention, others prayed never to be noticed again. When a concubine was chosen, her heart would freeze. Servants arrived with silk garments, perfumes, jewels. She was led to the Sultan's chambers, trembling, half dreaming, half terrified. If he was pleased, she might rise. If not, she would disappear back into the sea of forgotten faces, and no one ever asked where she went if she didn't return. The harem was filled with voices that could not speak, souls that could not escape. Their pain was quiet, their rebellion invisible. But inside, they were breaking, slowly, silently. Some found escape in faith. They whispered verses of the Quran beneath their breath when no one was watching, praying not for freedom, but for forgiveness, for being alive while so many others had perished. Others turned to poetry, writing secret verses on scraps of parchment, hiding them under mattresses or behind loose tiles. Little fragments of themselves left behind, so the world might one day remember they existed. And then, there were those who sought refuge in friendship. Fragile, forbidden bonds formed in the shadows. A shared glance in the garden. A hand clasped in fear. A quiet promise whispered before sleep. If one of us escapes this place, she will remember the other. But promises were fragile things. When punishment came, it came without warning. A favorite accused of insolence. A servant caught gossiping. A concubine suspected of jealousy. There was no trial, no defense, only silence. They were taken at night, barefoot, their jewelry stripped away. The women learned not to scream. Screaming made it worse. The harem demanded beauty even in suffering. Their tears were wiped before they fell, their faces composed like dolls. And in the morning, their rooms stood empty. Beds made, perfumes still lingering in the air. The other women would avoid looking at the door, as if to do so might summon the same fate. The cruelty of the harem was not always in its violence. It was in its stillness. The suffocating perfection of it all. The endless, graceful routine that masked despair. The way grief was forbidden. The way memories were erased as if they had never existed. No one outside would ever know their names, their stories, or their pain. The poets who wrote of the Sultan's splendor never mentioned the girls who stared at the same sky through gilded windows, wondering if their families were still alive. In time, even Gulbahar forgot the sound of her mother's voice. She began to think in Turkish, to dream in the language of her captors. Her old self dissolved like ink in water. And yet, sometimes, just before dawn, she would see it all again. The field of her childhood, her father's laughter, the church bells across the valley. Then the vision would fade, replaced by the cold marble of the harem floor. One morning, she saw her reflection in the polished bronze mirror and did not recognize the face that looked back. That was the cruelest truth of all. Not that the harem killed them, but that it made them forget who they were before it began. The empire recorded the lives of sultans and soldiers, of battles and treaties, but not of these women, the ones who lived and died behind the silk curtains of history. Their graves bore no names. Their stories were whispered once, then silenced forever. And so they remain, unseen, unspoken, buried beneath marble and gold. Because in the Sultan's paradise, there was no room for grief. Only silence, only obedience, only survival. In the golden cage of the Ottoman harem, where obedience was law and silence a form of survival, a few women refused to remain shadows. They learned to smile while plotting, to bow while manipulating, to turn the very tools of their captivity into weapons. And in time, some of them would rule, not from the throne, but from behind its curtains. The first was Horrem Sultan, known to Europe as Roxolana, the red-haired slave girl from Ruthenia, who captured the heart of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire's greatest ruler. She was brought to the harem like countless others, a war prize, sold into servitude, trained to please a man she had never met. But unlike the rest, Hurrem had something the others didn't: ambition wrapped in gentleness, intelligence hidden behind laughter. When Suleiman first noticed her, she did not tremble like the others. She spoke boldly, even teasing him, a dangerous act in a world where the Sultan's displeasure meant death. But he was captivated. Soon she became his favorite, and then something no concubine had ever been before: his legal wife. The harem erupted in fury. Tradition was broken, and Hurrem's rise shattered centuries of custom. But she was not content with luxury. Her eyes were set on power, for herself and for her sons. From within her gilded prison, she began to weave her web. Letters written in delicate calligraphy guided foreign alliances, whispered commands reached the ears of ministers, and every rival who dared to challenge her found themselves isolated, exiled, or worse. Her most dangerous enemy was Mahidevran Sultan, Suleiman's first concubine and mother of his eldest son, Mustafa. Mustafa was beloved by the army and adored by the people, the natural heir to the throne. For Hurrem's own son to rise, Mustafa had to fall. And so she waited, patiently, strategically. Whispers began to circulate through the palace. Rumors of Mustafa's ambition, of letters exchanged with foreign powers, of secret plots against his father. None could be proven, yet all were believed. In 1553, Suleiman ordered his own son's execution. The prince was strangled by silk cord inside his tent. Hurrem had won, but at a cost no mother could ever truly bear. In her rise, the harem's blood had stained her hands as deeply as any sultan's sword. Years later, another woman would inherit that same throne of shadows, Kosum Sultan, perhaps the most powerful woman in Ottoman history. She entered the palace as a Greek slave, beautiful and soft-spoken. But beneath the calm exterior was a mind sharper than any vizier's. She became the favorite of Ahmed I, and after his death, the empire fell into chaos: child sultans, court conspiracies, assassins moving through the corridors by night. And through it all, Kosum remained. When her young sons and grandsons took the throne, she ruled in their stead, first as regent, then as the true sovereign behind the veil. Ministers bowed before her decisions. Envoys from Europe addressed her with reverence and fear. But power in the harem came with blood. When rival mothers and stepmothers sought to place their sons on the throne, Kosum fought back with the same ruthless intelligence that had once kept her alive. She ordered exiles, imprisonments, executions. Each act was done in whispers. No sword, no open decree, just the quiet disappearance of those who stood in her way. Yet even the queen of the harem could not escape its curse. Her own daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, plotted against her. In 1651, Kosem was strangled in her chambers with the same silk cord once used for princes, the instrument of royal mercy and royal death. Her final moments were silent, a fitting end for a woman who had lived her entire life in shadows. The stories of Harem and Kosem are not tales of liberation, but of transformation. They did not escape the cage, they ruled it. In a world built to contain them, they became the architects of destiny. Their power came not from love, but from calculation. Their thrones were carved from sacrifice, from the lives of their rivals, their sons, their own innocence. And yet, in their defiance, they carved a space for women in an empire ruled by men. They proved that beauty could conquer armies, that a whisper could kill more surely than a blade. The courtiers called them witches, poisoners, temptresses. But history remembers them as something greater, survivors who turned their suffering into dominion. Their reigns marked the era known as the Sultanate of Women, when concubines ruled the Ottoman court through cunning and blood. The empire itself became a mirror of the harem, fragile, beautiful, and filled with deadly intrigue. Through them, the palace learned a final truth, that power, once tasted, would never again belong to men alone. Because the women of the harem had learned the cruelest lesson of all. To live in a world built by men, they had to become more dangerous than them. By the dawn of the 19th century, the empire that had once stretched across 3 continents began to tremble beneath its own weight. The Ottoman world, once so proud, so absolute, was now a fading echo of glory. And within its heart, the great harem of Topkapi Palace, once the most feared and desired place on earth, began to wither in silence. For centuries, the harem had been more than a prison. It was a political machine, a world within a world, where whispers could shape empires and beauty could start wars. But as Europe advanced with steam and steel, the Ottomans were trapped in velvet and tradition. The Sultan's harem, once a symbol of divine power, became an emblem of the empire's decay. The New Age had no room for silken chains. Western diplomats and reformers began to speak of modernization, of constitutions, of equality and progress. The world outside the palace walls was changing, and the empire could no longer hide its shame behind golden doors. The old ways were dying, and the harem that once glowed with laughter, music, and intrigue grew colder by the year. Sultans who once commanded armies now struggled to command their own courts. Power slipped through their jeweled fingers like grains of sand. And inside the harem, the women who had once ruled the empire through cunning and seduction found themselves irrelevant in a world moving toward modernity. The Valid Sultan no longer whispered commands that could alter the fate of nations. The Kizlar Aga, the black eunuch who once guarded the empire's most sacred secret, became a relic of the past. The fountain still murmured in marble courtyards, but the sound was hollow, the music of an empire dying in beauty. When Sultan Abdulmejid moved his court to the new Dolmabahce Palace in the mid-1800s, the harem followed, but something had changed. The new palace gleamed with European chandeliers, French mirrors, and Western manners. The old rules, the rigid hierarchy of odalisques and favorites, began to dissolve. The harem no longer held the same terror or power. It had become a shadow play, beautiful, distant, meaningless. Women wore Parisian fabrics instead of Ottoman silks. They learned music, languages, even science. Some dared to read newspapers, to dream of a life beyond the lattice window. And outside, the empire was collapsing. Provinces rebelled, armies mutinied, the treasury emptied. The Sultan's world, once absolute, was now surrounded by enemies within and without. When the Young Turks' Revolution erupted in 1908, demanding reform and an end to autocracy, the old world cracked open. The harem's silence deepened. By the time the empire entered the First World War, even the palace could no longer afford its own illusions. Then came the final blow, the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. The Sultan fled into exile. The caliphate was abolished. The new Republic of Turkey rose from the ashes, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who vowed to drag his nation into modernity and to bury the ghosts of its imperial past. The harem, the heart of that old empire, was closed forever. The women who remained were dismissed or married off, their titles stripped, their names forgotten. The eunuchs left through the same gates they had guarded all their lives. And in Topkapi, the great golden doors were sealed. The corridors that had once echoed with laughter, with music, with the rustle of silk and the cries of jealousy, now stood empty. Dust gathered on the mosaic floors, mirrors dulled, perfume faded into stone. The same corridors that once echoed with laughter and screams now whispered only with ghosts. Visitors would come centuries later, walking through those rooms of marble and mother of pearl, tourists gazing at the relics of beauty and cruelty, unaware of the tears that had soaked those walls. The gilded beds, the silver mirrors, the tiny fountains, all stood like monuments to a world that had devoured its own heart. And perhaps, in the quietest hours of night, if you listen closely beneath the hum of the Bosphorus winds, you can still hear it, a faint sound soft as silk, the sigh of the forgotten women of the harem. They lived unseen. They loved in silence. They died without names. The empire that caged them has long vanished into dust, but their shadows remain, woven into the marble and the moonlight. Because history does not forget beauty, and beauty never forgets pain. In the end, the story of the Ottoman harem is not one of love or pleasure, but of power. It was a world built on beauty, yet haunted by fear. A paradise gilded in gold, yet soaked in silence. For centuries, poets, painters, and travelers dreamed of it, the shimmering world behind the palace gates, where sultans reclined upon cushions of silk, surrounded by women whose eyes could bring kingdoms to their knees. But the truth, as always, was far crueler than the dream. The harem was not the empire's treasure. It was its reflection. Every jeweled mirror, every whispering corridor, revealed the sickness that grows when one man's desire becomes law. Inside, love was measured in obedience, passion was a privilege, and beauty, that most fragile of gifts, became a weapon and a curse. The women who lived within those walls were both captives and conspirators, queens and corpses, saints and sinners. Some learned to survive by submission, others by cunning. A few turned their captivity into empire, but all of them paid a price. Their smiles were masks, their perfumes the scent of fear. The sultans, too, were prisoners, bound by the very pleasures they commanded, surrounded by everything yet consumed by nothing. The same desire that crowned them as gods stripped them of their humanity. For in a world where every wish could be fulfilled, love withered into paranoia and trust drowned in silk. Perhaps the harem was never just a place, but a symbol of the empire itself. A world of splendor built upon suffering. A golden palace crumbling under the weight of its own desires. And when that empire finally fell, its ruins were not only in its cities and palaces, but in the hearts it had silenced, the countless women whose names were never written, whose voices never heard. They were the breath behind the curtains, the eyes behind the lattice, the ghosts that history tried to forget. Yet their shadows still linger, in the marble halls of Topkapi, in the stories whispered through time, in the haunting truth that beauty and power can never coexist without tragedy. Because the harem was not the empire's pleasure, it was its wound. A wound that bled in silence for centuries. And so, when we speak of the Ottomans' glory, we must also remember their darkness. Because behind every golden curtain was a grave, behind every smile, a secret, and behind every emperor, a ghost of the women he destroyed.